This is part 12 and the final part of my series looking into the miscarriage of justice that put Lucy Letby in prison for murders and attempted murders that she did not commit. And this is just kind of a final wrapping up of some of the things I said and a way to send a general message of malcontent over this, by all accounts, wonderful person being targeted and persecuted and tortured and then put in prison with 15 whole life sentences for things she didn't do based on the word of madmen and liars. So just to examine all of it in one place as concisely as possible. And that's not to say it's the last video I'll ever post, but in this series, it's the last one. So I guess the way I'd like to start is to just acknowledge that there's nothing more horrible than the suffering of a child, any child. And obviously, when babies die, we need answers. We want to know why. We want to know whether someone was responsible. And above all, we want to make sure it never happens again. So all of those instincts come from compassion. Whether you think Lucy Letby is guilty or not, it's all coming from the same place, compassion for children and for the suffering that many children endure in many different ways in our society today. But these tragedies create fear, right? And fear creates a kind of urgent need for explanation. And sometimes that need for the explanation becomes so powerful that we accept certainty before certainty has even been earned. And I think that's the danger that lies at the heart of Lucy Letby's case and the situation and nightmare that descended upon her starting in 2016. Babies died and collapsed at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Families suffered unimaginable loss. And they deserved the truth then and now. But what is forgotten by those who refuse to see the absolutely absurd evidence that was put to the court trying to prove her guilt is that Lucy Letby deserved something equally as fundamental as those children, and that's a justice system determined to discover what happened rather than one that became convinced of who had done it and that someone had done it at all. And as most people who are rational and reasonable feel, I feel that serious questions remain about whether that distinction was ever maintained by people who are meant to uphold justice. Justice Goss, Nick Johnson, the prosecutorial barrister. Did they uphold justice? The police, the Chester police, did they uphold justice? I don't think they did. I don't know that they intended not to, but they didn't. Before Lucy Letby became known throughout the world, not just Britain, not just the UK, but the world as a serial killer, she was a neonatal nurse working in a hospital experiencing a failing neonatal unit. And because of that, an unusual number of deaths and deteriorations of the children under their care. So then doctors on her unit, notably Stephen Breary and Ravi Jairam, came to suspect her. And that suspicion became enormously consequential for Lucy Letby and for the world. But suspicion isn't evidence. And one of the most troubling things and questions is how events that had initially been understood as medical tragedies came retrospectively to be interpreted as deliberate attacks. If doctors genuinely believed that babies were being intentionally harmed, why didn't they have their concerns investigated immediately, as was their duty to the law to do so? But their own clinical decisions, the conditions of the unit, staffing, infection, standards of care, and alternative explanations also had to be investigated with equal intensity as their belief that someone was harming these babies. That also was a duty. And the question should never have been what alone, it shouldn't have been what did Lucy Letby do? It should have been what happened to these babies. Why did they collapse? Why did they pass? The questions sound similar, but they're fundamentally different. One begins with an event, searches for an explanation. The other begins with a suspect and searches for evidence. And that's where the Chester police carried an enormous responsibility in this debacle and should be held to account. They really should. Perhaps replaced entirely. I don't know. But that's not for me to say, and perhaps I shouldn't even suggest that, but I am. Because once the police accepted the possibility that Lucy Letby was deliberately harming infants, they had a duty not merely to prove that theory, they had a duty to disprove it. That's their duty, disprove it. And they did the opposite. And the distinction matters because a good investigator should constantly ask, what if our suspect is innocent? What evidence contradicts our theory? Were similar collapses occurring when she was absent? Were there natural explanations? Were there problems with medical care? Were there infections? Were premature and extremely vulnerable babies deteriorating for reasons unrelated to criminal activity? Did selection of the events itself create an apparent pattern? Instead, any critic of the investigation, including me, argue that it developed tunnel vision. Lucy Letby became the organizing principle through which these events were interpreted. And once that happens, everything changes. And there's no turning back unless somebody brave says, stop, this is crazy. We need to relook at this. Being present becomes suspicious. Writing notes, sending texts, remembering a child that died in your presence is suspicious. Being present for multiple deteriorations when you were the most experienced nurse on the unit becomes suspicious. Eventually, the hypothesis begins to prove itself when all of those things are suspicious because you're trying to prove something rather than disprove it. Lucy is suspected because she was present when babies collapsed. And the collapses are considered suspicious because Lucy was present. That's circular. That's circular reasoning. And circular reasoning can be devastating when it carries the authority of a power like the police. Doesn't require corrupt officers. It really doesn't. And that point matters. I'm personally not suggesting some kind of secret conspiracy. Who knows? Maybe there was one, but that's not necessary. We don't even need to, it's just not necessary to even consider that. It's confirmation bias, which is a very simple thing that we all struggle with. It's ordinary and very dangerous for that point, for that reason. If this was a conspiracy, at least it could be exposed. Confirmation bias is just an inborn part of being human. But an investigator has to transcend that. They are trained to. And these investigators did not. Paul Hughes, Danielle Stonier, doing both family liaison work and questioning Lucy, they didn't transcend confirmation bias. And it's ridiculous. It's clown-like. It's dogberry behavior. Evidence supporting their belief became memorable, and evidence that contradicted it seemed less important to them. like Michelle Warden calling and talking to somebody about the fact that I think she called about Lucy's grievance being upheld and the doctors having to apologize. She may also have called about the RCPCH report or both, but either way, she called the Chester police and said, "Have you seen this? Or are you taking this into consideration?" And they weren't interested at all. They just wanted to know if Michelle knew Lucy. That's taking evidence that contradicts what they want to believe and ignoring it. That is not an investigator. These people don't deserve awards. They deserve they deserve to be removed from their posts, frankly, in my opinion. Witnesses were questioned within that theory. Experts were given records from cases that would support their theory. The experts, quote unquote, Dowie Evans finds suspicious features because he wants to. The conclusions that he drew strengthened the confirmation bias. The prosecution drew strength from it and from the public narrative driven by the media. Eventually, everybody appears to be confirming everybody else. There's no reason, as in, there's no reasoning ability, there's no constructive thinking, critical thinking. And no one considering what if the original assumption was wrong that all of this is built on. Nobody considering that. I honestly don't think they did. If they did, that would be a conspiracy. But I don't think they were smart enough to. Even these barristers weren't smart enough to. And they're supposed to be smart. Paul Hughes, okay, he can be dumb, I guess. But Nick Johnson, he should have been able to look at this and critically decided this is not a case that we can pursue. But he didn't. The entire structure reinforced an error. Medical expert witnesses always carry extraordinary responsibility in these cases. And in this case, the medical expert witness carried extraordinary responsibility. Jurors are not neonatalists, they're not pathologists, they're not specialists in complex neonatal medicine. And when an expert explains that a baby's collapse represents air embolism, poisoning, deliberate harm, jurors naturally give that evidence considerable weight. They don't, what are they supposed to do? Some supposed expert, even though he was a retired pediatrician and not a neonatologist, but he's on the stand. Everybody's got him on the stand. There he is. He must know what he's talking about. They have to believe him. And this makes humility on his part essential, which Dowie Evans simply does not have. I don't think he's ever even looked up the definition of the word humility. An expert has to distinguish between possible, probable, and proven. Earlier clinical and pathological reviews of these deaths did not identify deliberate harm in a way that the prosecution alleged. Other concerns about care in clinical circumstances did. They existed before all of this debacle came into the public sphere. That should have made everybody exceptionally cautious. How did deaths that were not originally diagnosed as murder later become murders? How? What changed? Was there new physical evidence? Or were old medical records being interpreted through a new hypothesis, through that confirmation bias? Those are the questions that the justice system should welcome because science becomes stronger through challenge. If a medical theory can't survive serious scientific disagreement, it should never be strong enough to imprison someone for life, and yet it did. Foolish evidence, foolish science, phony pseudoscience put Lucy Letby in prison for the rest of her life, took her out of her parents' lives. The prosecution then, as a result, inherited an enormous responsibility. Its purpose should not be to win. Nick Johnson shouldn't have been focusing on winning. He never should. None of them should. The focus should be justice. And yet, because of the egos that we've all developed in this society, all he cared about was winning and filling his pockets and accolades and being the hero. His purpose should be justice. In a case involving dead babies, The emotional advantage possessed by the prosecution is overwhelming. Once a jury hears that a nurse deliberately murdered infants, ordinary events can immediately acquire sinister meanings. The notes, the staffing charts, the Facebook searches, a recollection of somebody that turns out to not even be a recollection at all, Ravi Jayram. A coincidence becomes evidence. Each piece appears to confirm the others when you're coming from this point of view. But quantity cannot substitute for quality. So 10 uncertain pieces of evidence don't automatically become one certainty. The prosecution had an obligation to ensure that the case was not merely a compelling narrative, a good story, a horror story, a Stephen King story. It had to be reliable, and it wasn't. And it needed a judge who was fair and balanced. The judge, of course, didn't determine Lucy Letby's guilt. The jury did. But the judge, Judge Goss, controls the legal environment in which a jury reaches its decision. That makes the judge the final guardian of fairness. This was an extraordinarily complicated medical trial involving numerous infants, competing medical explanations, retrospective memories, expert testimony that was more like the ramblings of a, let's just say, unbalanced person, clinical records, and alleged methods of harm. The risk of cumulative prejudice was enormous. And the judge's responsibility was enormous too for that reason. And his responsibility became even more serious after the first trial. Following Lucy's convictions, Britain and the world, but particularly the UK, was completely flooded with coverage describing her as one of the country's most notorious child killers, evil, opening the door to hell, angel of death. Her face was everywhere. Allegations were everywhere. And her defense rightfully argued that the extraordinary publicity meant a fair trial was no longer possible in the second trial for child K. But Mr. Goss allowed the retrial to proceed. And then the Court of Appeal later upheld that. Legally, that's where the matter stood. But we're still required, not entitled, we're required to question the wisdom of it when we see all of the evidence pointing to the opposite of guilt. How does a juror erase what they already know? How does someone forget that the woman sitting before them had already been convicted of murdering babies? Judges can instruct jurors to consider only the evidence, but jurors are human. They're not legal professionals. They're not trained for this. There are limitations to what instructions can erase. And I believe the court should have treated that danger with even greater caution. I think most of us do, who believe Lucy Letby is innocent, or at least that she deserves a fair trial. Because when somebody's liberty is at stake, probably fair should never be good enough. Probably should never be good enough. And it was for her. Why? And then this is where the circle becomes complete. Doctors suspect, police investigate around that suspicion. Experts provide theories supporting the investigation because they're not balanced and their evidence is worthless, as Justice Jackson told Justice Goss in the first trial that Justice Goss then ignored and allowed the jury to decide. Court permits the evidence to reach the jury. Jury convicts. Convictions validate the doctors, the police, the experts, the prosecution, the court. And then the public asks, how could all of those people possibly be wrong? And that's the people who think she's guilty, who just buy hook, line, and sinker what they were told. But that their question misunderstands institutional failure. They don't all have to make separate mistakes. They can inherit one another's assumptions, and that's what happened here. The mistake traveled through all the systems. As the psychologist who was offered to the Chester police during the investigation because it was so traumatic for them. The stories they were telling themselves, their fairy tales that they were building were so traumatic for them that they had a psychologist. And she said the danger of this kind of case and the pain it causes is that it mushrooms out from the individual to the group to the society to the system. She didn't realize what she was describing was confirmation bias and witch hunts. Mistakes travel. One suspicion becomes an investigative hypothesis, and then that hypothesis is interpreted and brought to court and led to a conviction, and then the circle closes. We don't need to replace Lucy Letby with another monster. It's tempting to do so. There are a few monsters in this situation. Ravi Jayram, lying monster. Sorry, Ravi, lying monster. Or at least monstrous behavior. I'll remove the identification assignment. But monstrous behavior. Stephen Breary, monstrous, malicious behavior. Prosecution experts certainly seems pretty monstrous and malicious. I don't think every Chester police officer was conspiring. I'm not even suggesting that Goss deliberately sought an unjust outcome, although it certainly seems that way. I think they probably all sincerely believed that they were doing the right thing, but that's precisely the point here. A miscarriage of justice doesn't require evil people. It requires human beings who become too certain. It's easy to create monsters here. Just like we want to create monsters in order to solve the problem of child abuse and child suffering. We create monsters and we latch onto the monsters like society did with Lucy Letby. It's also tempting to do that here because of how maddening and stupid the situation is, how ignorant the people involved are. It's easy to do that, but that actually overcomplicates it. It's very simple. It's certainty. It's lack of curiosity that led to this place. You can't cure stupid. These people are stupid. They had pride that they didn't want to undo after years of investing time and energy into this case, after accusing a colleague of murder, after spending millions of dollars on a court case that was a complete shamble, a complete debacle and embarrassment for the world, not for the UK, for the world. That was created by the world, not just by the UK justice system, which in itself is a disaster, of course, but this is a crime against humanity that happened here. It's not just an unfair conviction, it's a crime. But all of that, all that was invested by these people, imagine being told if you were one of them that you may have been wrong. It's not just an intellectual challenge, it can destroy professional identity for all of them, career, reputation, which shouldn't be what matters, but it is in this society. So this is why independent review matters. We can't expect people whose reputations have become intertwined with a conclusion to be the only people deciding whether that conclusion was correct. Simply put, the families deserve better. A lie doesn't honor their grief. The truth does. Lucy Letby's parents deserve honor. They deserve relief from this. They've had to watch their child tortured almost to death for something she didn't do. And she's not with them now. They can only visit her in a prison somewhere. Even if she was guilty, their tragedy would be profound, but she's innocent. And they have to live with this. They've had to live with this rage for years. And then, of course, Lucy herself, hearing all of these things about herself, knowing that people believe she is capable of being a serial murderer of infants, knowing that something about her made people believe that this was possible. That's an oversimplification as well, but I can imagine that's how she feels. What is it about me? How could they have believed this about me? What a horror. And then to have the whole world not believe you, having only 3 people believe you, and knowing that you're going to rot in a cell for something you didn't do, and at the same time being the most hated person in your country. Her last public words as Nick Rowlands's film, The Botched Trials of Lucy Letby, highly recommended film. Best film made about her situation. So maddening, but just so well done. Her last 2 words ever spoken in public were, "I'm innocent." This humble, diligent, conscientious, empathic, and again, by all accounts, wonderful person, forced to plead to a judge who can't see through his own bias, only sees a female that he gets to destroy, doesn't hear her, doesn't care. What happens now? Evidence examined, case sent to Court of Appeal, prosecution refusing to bring it to court because they know they don't have a case, and Lucy exonerated, hopefully within a year. I know that I don't have any inside knowledge and I don't know really how it works, but let's hope. That's what should happen next. And also making a great effort to change these institutions that created this mess, not for the first time, but the worst time. Put effort and energy that you would spend pointing the finger and building a witch hunt against somebody toward fixing the systems that would allow that to happen at all. Fix the NHS. I don't know how. Fix it. Add more training to police forces. Training about confirmation bias. Compassion training. Completely overhaul the expert witness NCA list. Overhaul it. Erase, overhaul. If you have to pay more so that you get real doctors who are not retired, so that you get real experts, not secondhand experts. You get real neonatologists, not Dowie Evans, the retired pediatrician. Change the court system in many ways. Many say change the adversarial system. I would also say change the fact that you can't have access in the UK to the courts or the transcripts without paying a lot of money. Allow transparency for court processes. Allow the press to talk about cases while the cases are going on. Come on, what is that? It's no longer about the jury seeing evidence. They're seeing press about the case. They have the internet. They're going to see it if they're going to see it. Change that. Make it so that it's not possible to skew a narrative against someone who has not been proven guilty yet. Change the Court of Appeal so that it's not about upholding the system, but it's about upholding justice. And send the energy of healing to humanity as a whole so that we can stop throwing our fear at one another, our fear at the state that society is in, our desire to create monsters instead of looking at the truth of a situation. So that we can look at our own flaws, Stephen Breary, Ravi Jairam, Gibbs, and all of them, rather than blaming others because we're too afraid to face the fact that we aren't able to do our jobs up to the standard that we should. Find courage. We need to find courage to step forward even when it might hurt. Lucy Letby is innocent. Free Lucy Letby today.